Hey everyone, welcome back. Gabriella Huffman here to help you study for your North Carolina real estate exam. We're going to break down Chapter 8. Let's get started. Chapter 8 is all about agency agreements. So the two that we're going to focus on in this class will be the buyer's agreement and the listing agreement. We'll talk about property management in Chapter 12. Because there's a lot going on in this chapter, I made 4 different videos. So when you go to the YouTube channel, I want you to look for 4 videos. They're each going to be labeled as seen on the screen. First, we're going to talk about agency agreements. Secondly, about solicitation laws. Third, about antitrust. And lastly, the required disclosure forms. So agency agreements, you have to know this. This is always on the test. It's in your book. It's a little bump out. You should definitely highlight it. All parties must sign. So a listing agreement, the 2 parties to a listing agreement are the seller and firm. The 2 parties that sign a listing agreement will be the seller and the listing agent. A buyer's agreement, the 2 parties are buyer and firm. The 2 that sign will be buyer and buyer's agent. Agency agreements have to include the broker's real estate license number. It must have a definite termination date. They do not automatically renew, but they do automatically expire. And always agency agreements must have the prescribed non-discrimination provision. So let's start with a listing agreement. It's an employment contract between the seller and the firm. It does not guarantee the house will sell. The listing agreement is purely advertisement trying to attract a buyer. So you can't make the seller sell the property. There are lots of provisions or parts to the listing agreement, but I went ahead and outlined on this slide the really important ones you need to know. And then of course the ones in red, the ones you really need to know. So on the listing agreement, it's labeled property, but no, for the test, they like to call this the legal description. So can I have just a street address for a listing agreement? Yes. Does the listing agreement address square footage of the house? No. Does the listing agreement have meets and bounds, government survey system? No. So you want to know that part of the listing agreement, what they're asking for the legal description. Earnest money deposit, we'll talk about in a second. I have a whole slide on that. Very important to know. Who chooses the listing price? The seller. Even though you may have gone through a comprehensive CMA with your seller, at the end of the day, the seller chooses what price they want to list the house at. Terms of the listing agreement are addressed in the listing contract, expiration date, brokerage fees, special assessment. So remember, there are 2 types of special assessments, proposed and confirmed. Override extender clause, this is the protection period paragraph of the listing agreement. So make sure you're familiar what that is, what it's for. So when the listing agreement expires, this is that time, that protection period after the expiration, protecting the listing agent should that seller go and sell the house to a buyer that listing agent was the procuring cause of. The listing agreement will also tell us what type of agents the seller and the listing firm are willing to cooperate with, whether that's a buyer's agent, a sub agent, and what their compensation for that cooperation will be. Broker's duties and seller's duties are provisions to the listing agreement because those are the 2 parties to the listing agreement. In the listing agreement, we're going to talk about agency, especially dual agency. Remember, if your seller wants to practice dual agency or does not want to practice dual agency, this is the agreement we are getting that consent or no consent to do so. And of course, anti-discrimination clause must be in the listing agreement. So let's talk all about earnest money. So this is a very important slide. So please make sure you write this down or watch this section again. So the question is who writes the earnest money check? That's going to be the buyer. Earnest money is also called, make sure you find this in your book, good faith. Who holds the earnest money check? Think about it. the escrow agent, anyone that has a trust account. So a lot of people say, oh, the listing firm, the selling firm. Not necessarily, because that listing firm or that selling firm may not have a trust account. So the best answer for this is the escrow agent, because the escrow agent must have an escrow account in order to hold money of other people. So it could be the listing firm, it could be the selling firm, it could be the closing attorney, but never assume, always go with the best answer. Where is the earnest money check deposited? Well, what we talked about earlier, in the trust or escrow account. When is the earnest money due? So we see this in chapter 10, but I'm going to go ahead and talk to you about it now just to put it in your head. So on the sales contract, the earnest money is due either at the time of offer or within 5 days of the contract. So we'll see this again in 10, but it's good to go ahead and remember. So what are the 5 scenarios in which the buyer would receive the earnest money check back? Well, if the buyer turned it in with their offer and their offer was not accepted, they would get it back. If the buyer walks away during the due diligence period, the seller breaches, the buyer used a contingency to get out, or the buyer buys the house. So when would the buyer not get the earnest money back? Well, that would be if they walked away after the due diligence period has expired. So when does the seller get it? At that point, which we now call liquidated damages. Buyer's agreement, very simple, very similar to the listing agreement as far as the provisions there. So I really want to focus on the 2 provisions that will only be seen in a buyer's agreement, but not in a listing agreement. So the first one is the type of property. Notice the listing agreement addresses a specific property like 123 Main Street. The buyer's agreement is a little bit more open, a little bit more vague. You may say a specific county you want to focus on, or a type of property such as single family or townhouses. So that's what's different with a buyer's agreement, is we're not going to put a specific address. We're going to say kind of what we're looking or where we're looking for a buyer. Confidentialities of offers is important, and we'll see a lot of this language again in chapters 9 and 10. Offers belong to the offeror. So traditionally, the offeror would be the buyer making an offer to the seller. That offer belongs to the buyer, and that's confidential to them. So what you need to understand is that brokers, licensees, cannot disclose terms of a buyer's offer without the buyer's consent. When we're talking about terms, we're talking about the fill in the blanks of the offer, such as their offering price, how they intend to purchase the property. All the fill in the blanks are terms of an offer. So keep in mind that licensees, according to license law, cannot disclose terms of an offer to anybody without that offeror, or traditionally the buyer's consent. Now here's the trick. Sellers can. Sellers, unlicensed sellers, do not have to follow license law. So yeah, they can go tell about other people's offers if they want to, but as a licensee, we cannot do that. There are 3 types of listing agreements. You need to know all 3. I have the last 2 highlighted just because students get those confused. Open listing is just what it means. This listing is open to everybody, meaning one homeowner seller can list with 8 other agencies if they want to. It's open. So the only agency firm that brings the buyer wins, meaning gets paid. But the catch is not only are you competing with 7 other firms, you're also competing with the seller. So at the end of the day, the seller may bring their own buyer and nobody gets paid. Same concept in exclusive agency. However, exclusive agency is exclusive to one firm, but you're still competing with a seller. So if you have an exclusive agency agreement with a seller and the seller brings their own buyer, you do not get paid as the listing firm. So keep that in mind. It's exclusive to one firm versus open to a lot of firms, but you're still competing with the seller. Exclusive right to sell. Exclusive meaning, again, one firm is allowed to list that property, but that one firm is the only one that has the right to sell it. Meaning, seller, if you do bring your own buyer, the listing firm's still going to get paid. So the seller does not compete with you in exclusive right to sell listing agreement. How you terminate agency agreements. Very simple. Fulfillment or purpose. My job as a listing agent is to sell property or bring a buyer, right? I did it, done. Job as a buyer's agent is to help the buyer buy a property, done, fulfill. Our agency agreement is terminated. And you can see the other ones we talked about: expiration of terms, no automatic renewals. The parties can agree to terminate, parties can breach, operation of law, such as bankruptcy or eminent domain, destruction or condemnation of the property, death or incapacity of either party. So there's a star beside destruction, because I want you to keep in mind a listing agreement. If the property is destroyed, yes, that would terminate a listing agreement. But if I have a buyer's agreement with a buyer and I go to put an offer in on a house and then the house burns down the next day, does that terminate my buyer's agreement? It does not. I'm just going to go find another house for the buyer to buy. So all of this can be used for both agreements, but I want you to think carefully about that destruction of property. So that concludes just the agency agreements part of Chapter 8. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.